Dr. Barry McManus is a veteran of the CIA specializing in information ops and deception. He joins us as a guest tonight. Dr. McManus, always appreciate your time. I want to start with Navalny, 9-year prison sentence. No real surprise. Your thoughts on what happened to him in court today?
Okay, first let's start with what the definition is of what Navalny. He is a political prisoner. He is what some would call a sort of the idea of a prisoner of consequence. That is someone who holds political views that may be different than President Putin or the Russian government. Putin is simply rounding up all the opposition, anyone who opposes his political will. He's rounding them up and he's putting them in prison. I think, Marnie, the question that I would ask is, why is Putin exerting so much patience and spending so much time in rounding up these opposition's leaders? And my answer would simply be his distraction for the Russian people away from Ukraine. That's one way of doing it. And I think, too, is that Putin, unlike Stalin, is not going to massacre thousands or millions of people, but he'll do it in a much softer way, in a sense, of putting someone like Navalny in prison and see him suffer, and eventually possibly the same outcomes will be the same.
But isn't Putin doing that? Isn't he massacring thousands of people right now as we speak?
Well, not in the sense of Russians, and I speak of the Russian people.
Right.
If you want to consider the Ukraine, I'm not speaking specifically of the Ukraine, because I think what he's doing is letting the Russian people know that if you step over these lines, this is what could happen to you. So in the end, he's doing a couple of things. As I said, I think he's letting the Russian people know this is what could happen to you if you step over the line. And yet I'm not going to do, let's say, what Stalin would do, and that he would purge the Russian people. He would, kill them at thousands, or if not millions of people. So we're going to do it a different way. Whether these charges are trumped up or not, it doesn't really matter. The charges are what they are. He's going to serve 9 years in prison, I guess. And the idea is what's behind his mentality, what's behind his behavior for the Russian people to see.
And the motivation for Putin, obviously, this is his enemy. He speaks out against him. His goal is to silence him. Yet we see Navalny, even today, 9 hours ago, tweeting out to his followers, 3 million or so on Twitter, that any activity against the deceitful and thievish Putin's regime, I need action. So he's saying, in order to support me, I need you to take action. Words are not enough. So he's not silenced.
No, he's not. But what the upper hand that I think Putin has right now, that he's not silenced. But what is he doing to the supporters of Navalny? One, that opposition party has gone underground to a certain degree. A lot of them are in exile, which they've left the country. So in some ways, who's winning here? I would say Putin is winning because he does have the upper hand. The network of supporters that Navalny had is disappearing. They've gone on, as I said, gone underground, out of the country. And also there's a further crackdown on freedom of speech in Russia that also has an impact on the Russian people in general. So again, who's winning here? And in some ways, I believe he is still winning, even though the opposition party is still out there. But it's like choking the bear. I mean, after a while, he's going to pass out. So I think that's what he's doing to appease the Russian people.
Yeah. And I mean, we're talking about Russians in Russian prison, Navalny in this case. But I want to talk about the Americans being detained right now in Russia. Brittany Griner, Paul Whelan, Trevor Reed. There is also a Minnesotan. We spoke with his mom last week. She said that he was taken out of Ukraine and is now being detained by Russia. Given the situation and the dangers at hand, how concerned are you about these people being used as Putin's political pawns?
Well, are they political pawns? Maybe. It's sense of circumstances, unfortunately, for all of them who are there and who are being detained. Also, you have to think he's used the political power that he has to say that there may be a violation of the law. So whether the basketball player had oils or anything that was relevant to drugs, well, that's his premise. So I don't know if there's so much political pawns. I don't think necessarily they're going to be used. I think it's a mere fact of circumstances in the wrong place at the wrong time with something going on that's much bigger than them. And unfortunately for them that are detained there, I'm part of the political theater. Will he use that as part of his political theater? Why wouldn't he? So yes, he can use that as a bargaining chip along the way, because I think at the end of the day, one would hope there's going to be some type of political resolution to this. If not, if Russia actually wins victory in this whole Ukraine affair, then we're going to have a new world disorder. And that can mean many different things to many NATO countries, whatever that disorder will appears like. So I don't think he's going to win that. But I think right now, as you say, that these are political pawns, yes. But I see that more as unfortunate for them, people in the wrong place at the wrong time with the events that are going on in the world.
Yeah, I know their families worried for their safety. Before I let you go, I want to pull up that video of Vladimir Putin at the rally recently with thousands of people in that stadium. He is determined to push forward. He was pushing forth his propaganda, his assessment of what he believes is happening, this military operation in Ukraine. You're a behavioral analysis. That is where your expertise or part of it lies. Your observation of Putin in this moment, speaking to a crowd of Russians, his demeanor, his behavior, your take.
Well, first of all, he's angry. There's no question about that. And he's, as I said before, in a man like Putin, he's unpredictable. But I think behaviorally, why would he do some of the things that he's doing right now, even in his own country, even with opposition leaders? I think, in my opinion, it's still about greed. I still see that greed comes in many ways. It comes in a menu in many different ways. Some people are motivated by greed of money. Some people are motivated by greed of power. I still think this is a power trip for him. He is in that sort of aura of power. And he may, as I said once before, being an egomaniac, but I also see him, he shows ambitions that are borderline on megalomania. I think that's going on in his head. I think this whole rally and everything is part of the political theater that he is. He's writing the narrative. He's writing the narrative for what he wants to be considered and what he wants the Russian people to see him as. That's part of the theater for him. So he's in his own box. He is performing right now, and he wants to have his way. And I don't see him backing down. I see some acquiescence, I hope, on both sides. So there'll have to be some give and take here. Or if not, the Ukrainian people are going to continue to suffer. And right now, I'm more concerned about the Ukrainian people, the everyday man and woman who are, and child who's dying on the streets. So.
Me too. Dr. Barry McManus, always good to see you. Thank you. Thanks for watching. Click the red subscribe button below so you can get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.